Hey there. Today we're talking about Antarctica, that frozen continent at the bottom of the world. What if everything we've been told about it is just the surface? Literally, we're exploring what might be hiding beyond those glaciers. So get comfortable. And before we begin, if you're enjoying this kind of mysterious content, hit that like button and subscribe. It's completely free and we've got a goal to reach 500 subscribers before the year ends. Your support really helps us keep making these stories. Alright, let's begin. You know, when you look at a map of Antarctica, you see this white mass at the bottom of the page. All those measurements and numbers telling you it's the coldest, driest, windiest place on Earth. 14 million square kilometers of ice. Temperatures dropping to minus 90 degrees Celsius. Wind speeds that can literally knock you off your feet. We've got all these facts memorized like we actually understand the place, but here's what bothers me. Why does every official description of Antarctica feel so deliberately surface level, like someone giving you directions to a house but carefully avoiding mentioning what's inside? We're told about the thickness of ice sheets, about penguin colonies, about research stations with their colorful buildings dotting the white landscape. But whenever you try to dig deeper, whenever you ask questions that go beyond temperature charts and wildlife catalogs, you hit this strange wall of vagueness. It's not that information doesn't exist, it's that the information we get feels curated, like someone decided long ago what we should and shouldn't know about this continent. And honestly, that's where the discomfort starts, because Antarctica isn't just another place on the map, it's the one place that humans have collectively agreed to keep at arm's length, and maybe there's a reason for that beyond what we're told. So let's talk about what happens to people when they actually go there, because this is where things get interesting in a way that official reports never quite capture. Researchers, scientists, military personnel, they go down to Antarctica for months at a time, and when they come back, a lot of them describe something that doesn't fit into neat scientific categories. They talk about time feeling wrong. Not just slow or fast, but wrong, like the normal flow of hours and days stops making sense. One researcher described it as living inside a photograph where everything is frozen in place, including yourself, but you're somehow still moving through it. Another said that after 3 weeks on the ice, she couldn't remember if she'd been there for days or months. Her watch said one thing, but her body and mind insisted on something completely different. And here's the unsettling part: this isn't rare. It's common enough that there's actually informal training about it. They warn you before you go that your sense of time will get weird, but they never really explain why beyond the usual stuff about constant daylight or darkness and isolation. But is that really enough to explain why grown adults, trained observers, lose their grip on something as fundamental as time? Then there's the direction thing. You'd think in a place covered in ice and snow, where visibility can stretch for miles on a clear day, you'd be able to orient yourself pretty easily. But people consistently report the opposite. They describe walking in what they're absolutely certain is a straight line, only to find themselves back where they started. GPS devices work fine, the technology isn't the problem, but there's this persistent feeling that the space itself isn't cooperating. One veteran researcher told a story about marking a path with flags, bright orange ones visible from far away. He walked the path one morning, counting his steps, being methodical about it. The next day he tried to follow the same flags, and they seemed to be in different positions. Not dramatically different, but wrong enough that he couldn't shake the feeling that something had moved them, or that the ice itself had shifted in ways that shouldn't be possible overnight. And then there's this thing nobody really wants to talk about openly, but it comes up again and again in informal conversations. This sense of being watched, not by other people or animals, but by the place itself. Researchers describe standing outside their stations, looking out at the endless white and feeling like the landscape is looking back. One woman said she'd be working inside, going about her normal routine, and suddenly get hit with this overwhelming urge to go outside, not because she wanted to, but because she felt called. She'd stand there in the cold, staring at nothing in particular, and feel this strange mix of peace and absolute terror. When she mentioned it to colleagues, she expected them to laugh or suggest she was experiencing some kind of psychological break, but instead they nodded. They knew exactly what she meant because they'd felt it too. So what is it about this place that does this to people? Is it really just isolation and extreme conditions, or is there something about Antarctica itself that affects human consciousness in ways we don't understand or maybe don't want to understand? Now let's look at something that should bother us more than it does: the gaps in the official record. Antarctica has been the subject of scientific research for over a century. You'd think we'd have pretty comprehensive documentation of what's been done there. Expeditions research findings, day-to-day operations. And we do have records, mountains of them, but when you start looking closely you notice something odd. There are these blank spaces, time periods where documentation is surprisingly thin or missing entirely. Some of this can be explained by lost records, old expeditions where documentation was destroyed or never properly archived in the first place. But we're not just talking about the early days. There are gaps in modern records too. Research projects that were announced and then never mentioned again. Expeditions that set out with clear objectives and then returned with vague, incomplete reports. There's this one case from the late 90s where a geological survey team was supposed to spend 6 months mapping a specific region. They had funding, they had equipment, they had a clear timeline. And then about 3 months in, all communication became extremely sparse. When they finally came back, their official report was weirdly brief, just basic data points, nothing about what they actually experienced or any unusual findings. One of the team members was asked about it years later in an informal setting, and he got this uncomfortable look and said they'd been advised to keep their report factual and minimal. When pressed on what that meant, he changed the subject. Advised by whom? About what? These are questions that should have answers but don't. Then there are the research projects that just stop. Funding is pulled, equipment is withdrawn, personnel are reassigned, and the official explanation is always budget cuts or shifting priorities. Which, sure, that happens in science all the time. But the pattern is weird. It often projects that we're exploring something unexpected. Anomalies in ice core samples, unusual magnetic readings, structural features that didn't match geological models. These projects get attention, they generate interest, and then suddenly they're gone. And when you try to find out what happened to the data they collected, you hit dead ends. Classified for security reasons, lost in a filing system, corrupted beyond recovery. There are too many of these stories for them all to be coincidence or bureaucratic incompetence. It starts to feel like there's a deliberate effort to keep certain kinds of information from becoming public. And before you think this is just conspiracy thinking, consider this. Governments around the world have collectively agreed to keep Antarctica under a very specific kind of control. The Antarctic Treaty System, which sounds reasonable on paper. Preserve the continent for scientific research, prevent military use, protect the environment. But it also means that large portions of Antarctica are effectively off limits to independent investigation. And any research that does happen there is subject to layers of oversight and approval that don't exist for most other places on Earth. Let's talk about what's been seen from above, because this is where things get really uncomfortable. Satellite imagery of Antarctica is publicly available. You can look at it yourself right now. And for the most part it shows exactly what you'd expect. Ice, snow, glaciers, the occasional research station. But every so often people notice things that don't quite fit. Geometric patterns in the ice that look too regular to be natural. Straight lines and right angles in places where everything should be random and chaotic. Now the usual explanation is that these are just artifacts of the imaging process or natural formations that happen to look artificial. And sure, that's possible. Ice can do weird things, but some of these formations are really hard to dismiss. There's one area where satellite images show what looks like a perfect grid pattern stretching for several kilometers. When this was first noticed, people asked about it. The response from official sources was basically, yeah, we see it too. It's probably just a quirk of how the ice fractured. Probably. That word does a lot of work there. Because when you look at the image, it really doesn't look like a natural fracture pattern. It looks designed. Then there are the thermal anomalies. spots where the ice is warmer than it should be. Some of this can be explained by volcanic activity under the ice. Antarctica has volcanoes, we know that. But there are warm spots in areas where there's no known volcanic activity. And when researchers try to investigate these spots more closely, they often find that access is restricted or their permits get delayed indefinitely. One research team spent 2 years trying to get approval to study a particular thermal anomaly. They had everything lined up: funding, equipment, scientific justification. Their permit application just kept getting pushed back with vague explanations about environmental concerns or scheduling conflicts. Eventually they gave up. And here's the thing: that thermal anomaly is still there, still unexplained, still generating heat in a place where it shouldn't, but nobody's allowed to go look at it up close. Then there's the structural thing. There are areas in Antarctica where the ice surface shows these massive regular depressions, like something huge is sitting under the ice creating a pattern on the surface. The official explanation is that these are just normal variations in ice thickness. But when you look at the scale and regularity of these depressions, that explanation starts to feel insufficient. One geologist who worked in Antarctica for years set off the record that some of these formations look more like they're covering something than forming naturally over nothing. When asked what they might be covering, he said he didn't know and he wasn't sure he wanted to know, which is a hell of a thing for a scientist to say. So why are there places in Antarctica where you simply cannot go? The Antarctic Treaty designates certain areas as specially protected, and that makes sense on paper. You want to preserve pristine environments, protect wildlife, prevent contamination. But when you look at which areas are restricted and why, the explanations don't always add up. Some protected areas are described as sensitive ecosystems, which is reasonable. But then there are restricted zones in the middle of the ice sheet far from any wildlife or vegetation, just ice and rock. The justification for these restrictions is usually pretty vague. Scientific importance or environmental sensitivity without much detail about what specifically is being protected or why. And if you try to get permission to visit these areas even for legitimate research purposes, you'll find that the approval process is incredibly difficult. Applications take years, requirements are impossibly strict, and often the answer is just no with minimal explanation. There's this assumption that these restrictions exist for good, clear reasons and that experts somewhere have decided they're necessary for protection. But what if the restriction isn't about protecting the environment? What if it's about protecting us from knowing something? One researcher who spent years trying to access a particular restricted zone said the whole process felt less like environmental protection and more like security theater. Like the goal wasn't to keep the area pristine but to keep people away from seeing something. When he finally got frustrated enough to ask directly what the specific concern was, he was told that the area contains sensitive equipment, but satellite images of the zone show nothing. No stations, no equipment, just ice. So either the sensitive equipment is under the ice or that explanation was just a convenient way to end the conversation. And this brings up something that doesn't get talked about enough. The fact that private exploration of Antarctica is essentially impossible. You can't just decide to go there. Even if you have the resources, the ships, the equipment, the training, you need permits, you need approval, you need to coordinate with government agencies and international bodies. And if your proposed expedition involves going anywhere interesting, anywhere that might challenge the official narrative, you'll find that those approvals never come through. This level of control exists nowhere else on Earth. You can organize a private expedition to the Amazon, to the Sahara, to the deep ocean. It's difficult, it's expensive, but it's possible. Antarctica is different. Antarctica has gatekeepers. Here's something that really messes with your head. The memory issue. People who work in Antarctica often report that their memories of their time there are weird. Not just faded or unclear, but fundamentally strange. Like trying to remember a dream where you know something happened but you can't quite access the details. One researcher described keeping a daily journal during her 6-month posting, writing down everything that happened, her observations, her thoughts, her routines. She said that Reading the journal later felt like reading someone else's diary. She remembered writing it, she recognized her handwriting, but the experiences described felt foreign, like they'd happened to a different version of herself. Others talk about conversations they know they had but can't remember the content of. Not because the conversations were boring or unmemorable, but because the memories themselves feel blocked. One man said he remembered standing outside the research station having an intense discussion with a colleague about something they'd seen. He remembers the feeling of that conversation, the urgency of it, but he cannot for the life of him remember what they were talking about. And when he asked his colleague about it later, the colleague just looked at him blankly and said he didn't remember any such conversation. So either one of them is misremembering or something happened to both their memories. There are also these shared blank spots where multiple people remember that something happened on a particular day but nobody can remember what. Like there's this collective amnesia about specific events. One station had an incident where the entire crew independently noted in their journals that something significant happened on a Tuesday in March. They all wrote about it. They all marked it as important. But none of them wrote down what actually happened when they compared notes months later. Back home, they all had the same gap. They knew something occurred, they felt the weight of it, but the actual memory was just gone. This isn't normal forgetting. This is something else. And it raises an uncomfortable question. What if Antarctica doesn't just affect your perception of time and space while you're there? What if it affects your ability to hold onto certain memories? What if there are experiences that human brains simply can't or won't retain about that place? Maybe the question isn't what's behind the glaciers, but what the glaciers themselves are doing. What if the thing we're looking for isn't a place at all, but a state, a condition, a threshold? There's this recurring idea in the accounts of people who've spent time in Antarctica that the ice isn't just sitting there being ice. It's doing something. One physicist who worked at a research station described it like this. He said that ice is just frozen water. We treat it like it's inert, but water has properties we still don't fully understand, especially when it exists in massive quantities under extreme conditions. He pointed out that water can store information, that ice crystals form in patterns that reflect their environment, that massive ice sheets create their own magnetic and gravitational effects. And when you have ice that's been building up for millions of years, layer upon layer of frozen water, each layer capturing a moment in time, what are you really looking at? He suggested that maybe Antarctica's ice isn't just a record of Earth's history, but something more active, something that interacts with consciousness in ways we don't have the framework to understand. Which sounds wild until you remember that we barely understand consciousness itself. We don't really know what it is or how it works or why it emerges from brain activity. So how would we know if something in the environment was affecting it? Other people have described Antarctica not as a place you go, but as a place that pulls you in. Like there's some kind of boundary there, and crossing it changes something fundamental. Not in a dramatic movie way, but in a subtle shift that you only notice later. One explorer said that everyone who goes to Antarctica crosses a line, and once you cross it, you're different. You're part of a group that's been there, and that shared experience creates a bond, but also a separation from people who haven't. He said it's not about what you see there, it's about what you become exposed to, some frequency or presence or quality of reality that doesn't exist anywhere else. And once you've been exposed to it, you can't unexpose yourself. You carry it back with you. Another person described it as Antarctica being less of a continent and more of a doorway. Not a doorway to another physical place, but a doorway to a different way of experiencing reality. She said that the longer you stay there, the more the normal rules start to feel optional. Not broken, but negotiable. Time becomes flexible, space becomes uncertain, memory becomes unreliable. And the question is whether that's happening because of the isolation and environment, or because Antarctica is genuinely different in some fundamental way. What if the real secret isn't hidden in caves under the ice? What if the secret is that Antarctica is a place where the normal boundaries of human experience break down, where consciousness interfaces with something that challenges our basic assumptions about how reality works? Let's talk about the dreams because this is where it gets really strange. There are documented cases of people who've never been to Antarctica having vivid dreams about it. Not just random dreams, but dreams with specific consistent imagery. And what's weird is that these dreams often match across different people who don't know each other. They describe seeing structures under the ice, massive geometric forms that feel ancient. They describe walking through ice tunnels that shouldn't exist. Feeling drawn towards something they can't see. They describe standing on the ice looking up at the sky and seeing something that isn't the sun or stars but something else, something that makes them feel both terrified and calm. One woman who'd never been south of Australia started having recurring dreams about Antarctica in her 20s. She'd dream about walking across ice fields toward a mountain range, and in the dreams she always knew she was looking for something specific even though she never found it. Years later she mentioned these dreams to a colleague who'd actually worked in Antarctica, and he went quiet. He said she'd described a real location, a place he'd been, and more than that, she'd described the feeling he'd had when he was there. That sense of searching for something without knowing what. Now you could dismiss this as coincidence or the brain creating imagery based on photographs and documentaries. Except that some of these dreams include details that aren't common. Knowledge, specific formations, particular qualities of light, the way sound behaves on the ice. People who've never been there somehow dream accurate details about what it's actually like. Then there are the shared dreams, small groups of people having the same or very similar dreams on the same night. One documented case involved 3 researchers at different stations across Antarctica who all reported the same dream during the same week. They dreamed about finding an opening in the ice and climbing down into darkness toward a light source that felt wrong somehow. None of them had communicated during that week. They were at different locations. They had no way of influencing each other's dreams. But when they eventually compared notes months later, they'd all experienced the same thing. The official explanation, if there is one, would be that they all experienced similar environmental conditions that affected their sleep patterns in similar ways. But that doesn't explain the specific imagery. It doesn't explain why they all describe the same impossible light. What if dreams aren't just random brain activity? What if there's sometimes a way of accessing information that we can't get to consciously? And what if Antarctica is somehow leaking into people's unconscious minds even when they're thousands of miles away? So here's where we are in the timeline. We're in a period where the ice is melting faster than predicted. Areas that have been covered for thousands or millions of years are being exposed. And as they're exposed, people are noticing things. There was a report a few years ago about a research team finding what looked like carved stones in an area where the ice had recently retreated. The stones had patterns on them, deliberate shapes that didn't look natural. The team photographed them, took samples, submitted their findings, and then the story just disappeared. No follow-up, no further investigation, no explanation. When journalists tried to track down the researchers, one had retired early and wasn't talking. The others gave very brief statements saying their findings were inconclusive and they'd moved on to other projects. But the photographs exist. You can find them if you look hard enough. And those stones don't look inconclusive, they look carved. There have been other discoveries. 2. Anomalies that appear as the ice recedes and then get quietly explained away or ignored. A perfectly circular depression in the bedrock under where the ice used to be. Metallic objects that shouldn't exist in Antarctic geology. Formations that look like they might have been shaped by something other than natural processes. Each of these gets a brief moment of attention and then fades away. And the pattern is always the same. Discovery, excitement, investigation, and then silence. What's being found under that ice? Why does every discovery seem to lead nowhere? There's this growing sense that we're running out of time. Not in an apocalyptic way, but in a practical sense. The ice is melting, we're going to see what's under it whether we're ready or not. And maybe that's why questions about Antarctica are coming up more now. Maybe we're collectively sensing that whatever has been hidden there is about to become unhideable. There's this tension in the air around the subject. Scientists who work there seem more willing to talk about the strange aspects of the place, even if they're still careful about what they say. More people are noticing the gaps in the official record, asking questions about the restrictions. And every time someone tries to get real answers, they hit the same walls, the same polite refusals, the same vague explanations. It feels like we're at the end of something, like a long period of controlled information is starting to crack. Not dramatically, but gradually. Small pieces of the real story leaking out through the gaps. And finally we come to the question that nobody wants to ask directly, but that sits under all of this. Why is Antarctica only ever presented to us as a frozen wasteland? Why does every documentary, every textbook, every official description emphasize the cold, the isolation, the emptiness? It's the windiest place, the coldest place, the most inhospitable place. We're told again and again that there's nothing there. Just ice and rock and the occasional penguin. But what if that emphasis isn't about accuracy? What if it's about framing? What if we're being consistently directed to think of Antarctica as empty specifically so we won't ask what might be filling that supposed emptiness? Because here's the thing. Antarctica is described as hostile to life, and in many ways it is. But it's not hostile to everything. There's life under the ice, ecosystems in the lakes below the glaciers, organisms that thrive in conditions we thought were impossible. So why the insistence that it's barren? Why the constant repetition that there's nothing to see there? Maybe because if we thought there was something to see, we'd want to look. We'd ask questions, we'd demand access, we'd wonder why we're being kept away. The narrative of Antarctica as an empty frozen hell serves a purpose. It makes us not care. It makes the restrictions seem reasonable. Of course you can't go there, it's too dangerous, too remote, too pointless. But what if the danger isn't from the cold? What if the remoteness is maintained on purpose? What if the point is exactly what we're not supposed to find? I think the real secret of Antarctica isn't hiding in some cavern under the ice. I think the secret is in how the place makes us feel. That discomfort, that sense of wrongness, that persistent feeling that something about this continent doesn't fit into our normal understanding of the world. We feel it when we look at maps of Antarctica, that feeling that we're looking at something incomplete. We feel it when we read about expeditions there, that sensation that we're not getting the full story. We feel it in the way the subject itself seems to slide out of focus, like trying to remember a dream that fades as you wake up. Maybe what's behind the glaciers isn't a thing at all. Maybe it's a question. Maybe Antarctica is the place where our understanding of reality breaks down, and the real secret is that we're not ready to face what that means. We live in a world that makes sense, where things follow rules, where we can explain and categorize and understand. Antarctica challenges that. It's a place where those rules get fuzzy, where explanations fall apart, where understanding feels just out of reach. And maybe that's what's really being kept from us. Not specific information, but the acknowledgement that there are places on Earth where we simply don't have it all figured out, where something exists that we can't easily fit into our models and frameworks. So we keep it at a distance. We restrict access, we limit information, we maintain the narrative of emptiness, because the alternative is admitting that our picture of the world is incomplete, and that maybe some things are meant to remain beyond our full comprehension. At least for now. The glaciers keep their secrets not because someone is hiding them, but because we're not ready to handle what happens when those secrets are revealed. And every person who goes there and comes back changed, every researcher who can't quite remember what they saw, every dream that contains information it shouldn't, every gap in the record. They're all pointing to the same truth. Antarctica isn't just a place on a map. It's a boundary. And what lies beyond that boundary might not be physical at all. It might be perceptual, a different way of experiencing existence that we've spent centuries carefully avoiding. So the next time you look at a map and your eye slides past that white mass at the bottom, the next time you hear about Antarctic research and feel that familiar sense of vague disinterest, ask yourself why. Why don't we care more about this place? Why are we so content to leave it unexplored and unexplained? Maybe because deep down we know that some questions once asked can't be unasked, and some answers once found change everything.